Library. My name is Isabel, and I'll be your host for this evening. This is night 2 in our Author Festival, and tonight's theme will be talking to authors about their lived experiences. First up tonight, we'll be having our librarian, Chris Koth, interview local author, Bill Arnott. After that, we'll have Caitlin McRae interview several contributors to the anthology Big, including Jen Arbo, author Sonya Boone, and editor Christina Myers. And before we begin, I'd also like to thank the Arts Council of New Westminster for helping us put together this evening. Without further ado, here's Chris and Bill discussing Gone Viking.
In a moment, we're going to meet author, poet, singer, indie folk musician Bill Arnott. But first, take a look at this. So for those who aren't already aware, Bill Arnott is a Vancouver author, poet, songwriter. He is a best-selling author of Wonderful Magical Words and Dromomania. Love that word. Bill's indie folk CD is Studio 6. His work is published in Canada, the US, the UK, Europe, and Asia. And his column Poetry Beat is published by the League of Canadian Poets and the Federation of BC Writers. As you've seen, Bill has a 2019 Poetry Prize from Pandora's Collective and is shortlisted for the Whistler Independent Book Awards. He's also shortlisted for the American Book Fest Awards. And most recently, Bill has been granted a fellowship with the very prestigious Royal Geographical Society. Bill Arnott, thank you for joining us.
Chris, it's a huge privilege and pleasure to be here. Thank you.
We're here to talk about Gone Viking, and we've seen the new cover. This is the cover that some people might already be used to. COVID has certainly forced us to lock down all of our aspirations for travel. And one of the wonderful things about Gone Viking and what you've done here is you've given us the chance to embark on this journey, which is absolutely fantastic. Can you just talk a little bit about what the impetus for Gone Viking was?
Sure. Well, for years, I've not only enjoyed reading, but writing travel literature, travel log, travel memoir. I love the genre, even when we were able to travel. And it just seems now, during lockdown, an armchair escape now more than ever really seems to hit home, and people are getting a kick out of it and enjoying it. The impetus, I would say, was through some of my travels around Western Europe, and I would like to visit museums, and I was invariably surprised at there always seemed to be a Viking site. This great expanse of the Earth's surface. And then I put a little more time and effort into it, and it probably hit home for me. There's the Danish Viking Ship Museum is in a town called Roskilde, just outside of Copenhagen. And there was a map on the wall delineating where the Scandinavian explorers, the Vikings, or in that case, predominantly Danes, came and went and raided and traded and settled. And it covered, most of the northern half of the planet, with even things into the Mideast and parts of Asia. It was not only overwhelming, but inspiring. And I thought, oh, I want to go to there, where they say where the end of the earth drops off and there might be dragons. I want, and tying that in with the dragon ship prow, it all felt wonderfully romantic and inspirational. So then the next several years, I was making a concentrated effort through research and very pointed travel, and then meeting experts, archaeologists and anthropologists, to put together this travel saga. And I initially was playing off the word of Viking with a small v. It originally meant to go voyaging, traveling. You would go a Viking, and it came to label these Scandinavian explorers with a capital V, and now we think of these travelers and explorers as Vikings.
It's the book, but also the title. So to have gone Viking is to have explored.
That's my play on it, treating it like that verb. And I thought, because I was dedicating so much time and effort to this, going from my traditional day job, instead of flipping a sign that would say gone to lunch or gone fishing, in my mind, I'd literally gone Viking.
What's interesting to me is that it was a conscious effort to travel with this sort of layer of Viking lore hovering over you. But surprising to some of us is that you actually found locations in the Middle East that somehow were attached to Viking exploration. I don't know that many of us would have thought that.
That was a fascinating one. Turkey, what we'd call Turkey now, or they would say, or previously Constantinople or Byzantium, and the Scandinavians would call it Miklagard. And so around the Bosphorus and Caspian Seas there, Vikings became very desirable warriors for hire, almost like mercenaries, and they were in the royal guard there. And there was a time when there was actually a sizable exodus of Scandinavians to the Mideast and that eastern part of the Mediterranean. And I'm sure the weather might have been a nice appeal for folks from the far north. But these individuals were known as very cosmopolitan, skilled, just physically. They were a healthy, well-fed nation. So in a lot of parts of the world, they were deemed to be big, strong individuals. I'm talking about the men and the women, and rowing from a young age, and wielding weapons as tools as well as for military training. Next thing you know, there were a ton of Vikings in and around these parts of the world, in Asia and Turkey. And there's even very cool and rare rune remains in the Blue Mosque, the Hagia Sophia. Right. And that's a remarkable anthropological or archaeological remain that's still there today. You can see rune carvings in what is now a Muslim temple, and it was for many years a Christian temple.
The rate of migration that was taking place from Scandinavia to the Middle East, actually, you helped us discover that it was so much of a concern that the Scandinavian leaders themselves had to sort of help put a stop to it. They were afraid of such a vast amount of out-migration that they were losing all their people.
It's true. And so in that, I think it was really around the 9th, 10th, and maybe into the 11th century, they passed laws where kids couldn't inherit if they were abroad. In other words, there was such an exodus of that younger generation that they made sure they had to come back to Scandinavia if they wanted to inherit from the preceding generation. Yeah, it was a thing.
You're one of the things that I enjoyed was that you literally do travel with, like, we are allowed to travel with you as you both made your way through to all these different places, and your anecdotes, even sitting and waiting in an airport, are second to none. I have to say, we've all experienced these things, and yet somehow you nail it down and you capture it for us. You're actually saying the things that we all wish or thought that we would have wanted to recall about various aspects of our trips and so on. I'm really curious about your process of writing this saga, because it took place over 8 years, did it? And What was the process of assembling all of these anecdotes and memories?
Well, there's journaling happening all the time. One of my favorite tools is a weatherproof journal, and it's a unique kind of a waxy lead pencil you can use with that you can write in the rain. Or I've got my space pen you can write upside down in a jiggling train or a heaving boat, or through air pockets and turbulence. So it's lots of journaling. I like to say I don't want to break up a fun conversation or an interaction by taking notes. So you do your best to try to remember stuff, and at the end of the day, putting it down. And I believe I from a good day's adventures, I can probably retain 75 or 80% of some dialogue, or perhaps a gorgeous visual scene that I want to share a sensory experience with the reader. But you hit the nail on the head, Chris, when you said, chances are we've all been there. We've all had a miserable waiting lounge experience as, we're queued up for a flight that's invariably delayed.
Yeah.
And of course, maybe the more remote the place, the less frequent the flights, the greater the delays, but the greater perhaps the stories and the fun characters that we encounter. And perhaps retaining that sense of humor through it all makes it not only bearable, but in fact, kind of enjoyable. And certainly after the fact, it all seems predominantly good.
The other aspect of Gone Viking for me, and maybe this is just projecting my own interests in the world, was the food features quite prominently, or I would rather say delicately throughout this. And it's everything from partridge berry pie in one place, but more interestingly, fermented shark in Iceland, was it?
Yeah.
Is that something you've brought home with you and that you continue to enjoy?
Well, again, to clarify, I maybe never enjoyed it, but I certainly tried it, and when in Rome, as they say. But I've always felt like music or dance or story, cuisine is such an integral part of experiencing a place. It does speak to a culture and history. And with the Greenland Shark, that was an interesting one. That was in Iceland. And my wife Debbie and I did a food tour, which was just a couple of us and a guide. And some of the things were common and enjoyable, and some were a little more unique. That shark is, and if you know it, it's not unlike a basking shark, but these Greenland sharks are kind of like omnivores, and they're huge. And when they are caught, I once saw a film clip of an Inuit fisherman angler pulling one up on a hand line. These things are hundreds of pounds. They make a big halibut look small. Anyways, they air dry these things and bury it in earth for a while. So it's several months in the process to ferment this. And of course, in the day, it would have been that's a means of storing and preserving. You may not have salt as a preservative, and certainly weren't canning things in the day. So but like a lot of traditions, it's carried on to this day. I don't know if it's fast when they try to pull on travelers and tourists, but it is a pretty neat experience.
Your experience in Newfoundland, Labrador, you happen upon what ends up being a pretty interesting discovery that had been made. Want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It was a wonderfully serendipitous encounter. And as I realized this travel saga was taking place, and it just felt in following in the footsteps or the wake of Eric the Red and Olaf Crowbone, and then ultimately Leif Erikson, crossing that North Atlantic and a little bit of the Arctic. To me, it made sense just coming home literally to the quote-unquote New World, touching on Newfoundland and Labrador, and ultimately visiting the site of where Leif Erikson and his siblings made their a winter fort for a number of winters at Lansell Meadows in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we were just out for a meal, and George Decker was the fisherman a couple of generations back that first helped the Norwegian anthropologists, the Ingstads, discover that site where Leif Erikson's winter settlement was. Well, didn't I end up having a visit and meeting George Decker's granddaughter, over this partridge berry pie. So a very regional dish with a lovely historical thread that seemed to literally bring it all home. And she, knew the story of Granddad helping these Scandinavians prove that this was Leif Erikson's site, and the magic of that, and discovering a pin made from like a metal and forged iron, that was technology that didn't exist at the time amongst the indigenous Mi'kmaq or Beothuk. So it was a very magical discovery, and then being able to have this touchstone in the present day felt really, really special.
Do you, having gone through that and the writing of Gone Viking, are you anxious to take off again?
Oh, well, I right now, like so many of us around the world, we're still trying to flatten COVID curves.
Right.
The wanderlust is definitely peaked, and a missing facets of that, doing virtual connections and travel wherever possible. But I'm hungry to get back out there and just experience that, whether it's the bad flight or the bumpy train, all of a sudden those things, I'm longing for that again, Chris. Yeah.
If I could impose, would you treat us to an excerpt from Gone Viking?
I'd be delighted. I think it makes sense for me. I will share the prologue with you. That sort of sets a tone. And I'm going to refer to sculls, spelt with a C, those slender rowing boats. And the prologue to Gone Viking, a travel saga, starts like this. Sculls slice the bay, the softest splash in morning calm. Each stroke of oar swirls water into quotes, grasping at a poem, the reach and pull, a heartbeat. They do that on the Rideau, someone says. A coxswain barks instructions. The boats move on silent, save for an oarlock creak and gentle ripple of wake. Through this, a bold eagle flies, close enough to hear feathers moving air, while at a sculpture park it states, when you see an eagle, you know this is a special place. Last time I was this taken by the view, it was nighttime. Winter Olympics were here, and we met new friends at the rowing club pub, facing the stretch of water that resembles a thumb on the mitt of the inlet. Large windows in a patio look onto Vancouver's coal harbor, cruise ship terminal, and the industrial port's towering cranes. An Olympic cauldron anchored the scene, a pyramid of metallic beams crisscrossed into outsized kindling, a signal beacon burning proud. The fiery glow dampened city lights, leaving only flame visible dancing on dark water, the look of a Viking funeral.
Ha! Boy, talk about bringing it home. And that's just the prologue. Phil, we cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Chris, and to the New Westminster Public Library. You know I love your facility, and to the Arts Council for making this possible. It's a treat and a privilege, and if folks find Gone Viking on the shelves at the library, I hope they enjoy it. If they do want their own copy, they're retailers, and I thank them for that in advance as well.
All right. Best of luck to you, Bill. We hope to see you soon.
Thank you again, Chris.
Thank you, Bill and Chris. Coming up, we have Christina, Jen, and Sonya, interviewed by Caitlin as they discuss their contributions to the book, Big.
Thrilled today to be joined by three wonderful female writers here who have all contributed to a fantastic new book that came out in February this year. It's called Big Stories of Life in Plus Size Bodies. That's what it looks like. You can get it at the library or at bookstores. It is available now. It was published by Caitlin Press, which has nothing to do with me, even though my name is Caitlin, in February, and it has received glowing reviews from such luminaries as Candy Palmater and Ariel Gordon, and it was also on Quill Enquirer's Most Anticipated in 2020 list. Pop culture stereotypes, shopping frustrations, fat jokes, and misconceptions about health are all ways society systematically rejects large bodies. Big is a collection of personal and intimate experiences of plus-size women, non-binary and trans people in a society obsessed with thinness. It invites readers to ask questions about our collective and individual obsession with women's bodies. Lots of online reviews mention that people seem to really see themselves in these stories, that there's finally some representation for them, which I find to be a very powerful testament to this book. We have three wonderful guests with us today to discuss the book. First is Christina Myers, the editor of the volume and also a contributor. There she is. Christina is an award-winning journalist, freelance writer, and editor. After leaving the newsroom, she has turned her attention to more creative work, including fiction and narrative nonfiction. She holds degrees in journalism and psychology from Thompson Rivers University and the University of British Columbia, and is an alumna of the Writer's Studio at Simon Fraser University. We also have two contributors, Jen Arbo. Jen lives in Saffordton with her family. She has a diploma in professional writing from Douglas College and works in economic development. She loves karate and archery, strong tea, and excellent stationery. Good choices. And she was even the New Westminster Citizen of the Year in 2016, having been involved in all sorts of community initiatives and projects. And last but not least, we have Sonya Boone, who is an award-winning writer, researcher, and teacher. Her creative nonfiction has appeared in Geist, The Ethnic Isle, and is forthcoming in several edited collections. She has a critical memoir published last year titled What the Oceans Remember, Searching for Belonging and Home. And she's a professor of gender studies at Memorial University in Newfoundland. But prior to that, she was a longtime resident of the Lower Mainland, where she worked as a professional early music specialist, as performer and recording and touring. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to start with Jen, who wrote one of the pieces in this wonderful collection. Jen, how did you come to be involved in this collection?
So I think, like a lot of people, I found out about this through a post on social media. Christina and I have actually been connected for years through her work as a journalist. She was a journalist in New Westminster, so we were frequently sort of crossing paths and talking to one another about events, and eventually that spawned a friendship online. And, so she posted on social media and said, I'm editing this and you should submit. And I thought about it for ages before I finally sort of took the plunge and decided to submit something. And I wrote it specifically for the collection. I wrote it before submitting it, obviously, but it was once I saw the call, I started doing the writing.
Right. Did you ever imagine yourself being involved in a collection like this?
Probably not like this, because I don't think I ever imagined a collection like this would exist. I think for me, I have put my writing aside for a number of years as a parent, and I'm pleased that my child's now self-sufficient enough that I can kind of come back to it, and it's nice that it's there like an old friend. But I never imagined a collection that celebrates plus-size bodies would actually be something that would be not only published but popular.
That's fantastic. All of the pieces in this book required a lot of vulnerability from the contributors. Did writing this piece involve a lot of courage for you? And where did you find that strength?
Yeah, I'd say it did. I mean, it is like this element of vulnerability that is difficult to share. Something that maybe you're a little nervous about sharing, or maybe you don't even share it with people that are in your real life. So to write it and have it published and exist in a printed format is difficult. I think it's easier to draw from courage and bravery when you feel well supported. I'm fortunate that I am very well supported in my life, so it's easy. And also I have a great deal of my own confidence in myself. So part of my piece is very humorous and a little bit self-deprecating, but it is also a celebration of my own self.
Yeah. For you, is writing part of the process of being brave and facing the world, or is it more of a general thing, you talk a lot about parenthood and refinding yourself as an adult after a functioning human adult after the after the birth of a child. Is your process of writing more general, or do you find it to be very useful for dealing with the things that are difficult in your life?
I find, you say functioning adult human, and I do that sort of device a lot where I sort of title something and, apply uppercase letters and call it a title. And I do that a lot to sort of compartmentalize and to sort of manage, whatever part, and to label it. It's sort of like, if you name it, you can own it kind of thing. So I do that a lot. That device is helpful, not just for my writing, but kind of in my own life. And it's like, when you have a tantruming toddler, it's like, oh, the very angry toddler, and you sort of, if you title it that way, I think that sort of device is really helpful. And so I think that part of how I'll draw from strengths of parenting and draw from strengths of just processing my life as a human. I feel like that kind of works into my writing process. Most of my writing tends to be sort of inspirational, like when the mood strikes. Just my life doesn't really allow me to spend too much time just free writing, which is something I miss. And the pandemic has actually given me the opportunity to come back to that, which is an added bonus. So that's great. But I feel like that sort of inspiration has struck and I must label it and I must write it down. And so that's often how the process works for me.
Right. Your piece is called Encircled, and it has lots of images of roundness, also belts and snakes. You end with the image of Ouroboros, who's the snake that eats its own tail. How did this image relate to your experience of being a big person?
Yeah, so I think that snakes are very misunderstood as a creature. I think there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding of what snakes contribute in a community or to the environment. Sort of keeping vermin population down and bug population down. And so I think that snakes have had to exist kind of on their own terms and just sort of dealt with a lot of judgment, those poor snakes. So I started thinking about like how this is just sort of followed them around, and just like it's a constant thing where snakes, as important as they are and as useful as they are and as beautiful as they can be, they're frequently kind of, I don't know, judged and cast aside. So in looking for sort of how to shape the story, I wanted to connect the various parts by using images of sort of snakes and bites and scales and skins and just this idea of what a snake goes through. But I didn't actually want to write about a snake. So, this really had a lot to do with how I feel about myself as a plus size person as well. A snake is generally very long and skinny. They're not
Unless
short
they
and round.
really
So,
big.
exactly. So I had this image of like this very long and thin creature, but it can coil up and it can be, like you said, it can eat a pest and it can have this big fat spot. And you know what, that should be celebrated.
That's great. How has being involved in this project of this book changed your view of yourself, or has it? And what do you think when you read the other pieces in the collection?
So I'm very humbled that I'm in this collection. I feel pretty proud of myself to be included in such a group of amazing writers. And I feel that my writing has much to mature. So I'm 46 now, but I feel like I need to write for another couple decades to really sort of find that spot and that level of maturity that I read in the other contributors. So it's humbling. And I think that it's also something to be proud of.
Definitely. What do you hope people take away from this collection?
Well, so a friend of mine who lives somewhere else, I mailed her a copy. And she said she never would have picked up this book, and she never would have, been drawn to it at a bookstore, and she never would have thought to read it. But she herself is a plus-size person, and so she was able to identify a lot with a lot of the pieces. But I would really like for more people who aren't plus-size to read this book, and I would really like to see more people handing this book to husbands or spouses and saying, here, you need to read this. And I hope that that's something that happens, and that the pass on effect of people sort of identifying someone and saying, you need to read this book. That's actually what I hope people take away.
Yeah. Well, I think the commonality of many of the experiences that, I read about, I wouldn't have picked this book up if I wasn't talking to y'all, but I really enjoyed it. And I live with a big person, and it was very eye-opening for me as I don't consider myself a big person, but I live in that world, and we have friends and loved ones and neighbors, and we all do, who live with these realities. So it's really a eye-opening and consciousness shifting kind of collection. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Jen. Christina, so you're editor of this collection, and you're also a contributor. How did the idea come to you, and what was the starting point for this collection?
Wow.
I think there's so many different starting points. I had been involved in a few anthologies as a contributor, and one in particular that was sort of about women and bodies, that sort of intersection. And reading that book affected me quite a bit. And I, at the time, was getting more used to writing about my own body, putting more out there. And I had done a bit of, my original thought was, I'm going to write a whole collection of stories and essays about my body and how it interacts with the world and how it interacts with a professional workspace and how it interacts with dating and, you know, all of these sort of intersections. And I started working on that, and a publisher said, yeah, that sounds interesting. Let's do that. And I thought, great. And I continued to work on it and very quickly started hitting, I gotta finish it now. I pitched it, gotta finish it. And I sort of hit a bit of a wall. And at first I thought, am I hitting a wall because this feels too vulnerable? It's too much, it's revealing too many things. What I realized very quickly was that I was hitting a wall because it was all the same perspective. It was one perspective over and over and over again about different things, sure, but the same perspective. And I thought, this topic just needs many, many more perspectives. I need to know, what does this look like for somebody who is queer? What does this look like for a woman of color? And I'm not those things. I sort of exist in a fairly sort of privileged level in our culture. And so I thought, this is, it's just not interesting enough to talk about myself that many times over and over again. I really need to know what other people think and feel about this. And so I went back to the publisher and I said, I think maybe this could go this way. Yeah. And they said, yeah, tell us what that looks like. Let's reshape it. And then it went from there. So it sort of had multiple starting points, which I think is probably the case with a lot of projects where you jump in and then you step back and jump in and step back. And I'm just so grateful that those all led to, you know, today, basically.
Right. So Jen mentioned she saw the call on a social media post. Is that how you found most of your contributors, or were were you asking specific people who you knew already?
I would say 99% of the contributors came through social media. You know, I think there's anthologies out there where you're writing about, I don't know, marriage, or you're writing about all sorts of things. And you can say to somebody, hey, you're a great writer. I want to know what you think about this. Asking somebody to write about their bodies when you don't know how they feel about their own bodies. There was writers in my head that I thought, oh, they might have something to say. But to ask someone to do that when you're not sure, and I didn't want it to be just people who were already writing in this area. I wanted it to be people who had never written in this area. So how do you approach people and say, you look big enough, maybe you'd like to write something for this? So I just relied really on getting the word out as much as I could. And I feel lucky that I'm very connected to a writing community that sort of went, yeah, sure, we'll spread this out into our magic network. And it just sort of went all over. And the response was so immediate that I thought, okay, this is going to work. This is going to work really well. Because right away people started emailing and asking questions, you know, about topics and about who they were and whether that sort of fit the theme and all of that. So that was how we did that. So yeah, no, I didn't really specifically, there was a few people that sort of would say, oh, this sounds interesting. And I'd come back a few weeks later and say, nudge, nudge, you mentioned that sounded interesting. Are you sort of thinking about that? So, but other than that, no, I didn't sort of go out and commission anyone. And I'm glad, because I think the mix of what came in, there's people in this book who are first time being published. And there's people in this book who are coming from a more academic perspective, and people who are writing about bodies all the time. And so I think that the mix ended up really a really interesting mix because of that process. So
amazing. So there are many, the book has 26 contributors, which is quite a few, with a really wide variety of experiences, lived experiences. You say in your introduction that we all experience our bodies in our own ways, and how our bodies interact with the world, and how the world interacts with us. It's very individualistic. But there is a commonality of all of the contributors are women or have lived a female experience. I assume this was a conscious parameter that you put on the
yes
on the contributors. What would you say that differences are between fat women's experiences and to fat men's experiences in the world. I mean, there is a little bit of that in this book.
Yeah. I think there are parallels, there are parallels. And I think then there's also just worlds of differences. And you alluded to it briefly. There's one story in the book from a writer named Tracy Manrel, who lives here in Vancouver, who lived as a big, very tall and big body woman for most of their lives, and then now lives as a man. And so that story is what that is about, is when, what was that experience like to live in one body and to see how the world responded to that body, and then to live in a slightly different body and how the world is responding to that. And Tracy's quite clear, there's hard things still, but in a very different way, right? So even the words we talk about when we talk about fat men or big men are different, right? We use husky and we use teddy bear and we use all of these sort of much more embracing kinds of words. And I certainly would not suggest that body shaming doesn't happen for men, that there isn't a lot of body dysphoria. Increasingly, I think our social media world is increasing that effect. But there is just more policing around women's bodies, whether that's our size, who we're having sex with, what kind of careers we have, right? That policing is sort of ever present and constant in a way that it isn't always for men. And so having, I've never, of course, haven't lived as a man at any point in my life. I have 2 brothers and a husband and a son, and I can sort of see what the world is a little bit like through their eyes. And I think that it's the constancy of the pressure for women. My brothers didn't grow up reading 17 magazine that was really thinly veiled half diet tips most of the time, right? How to get into that prom dress or ways to, look slimmer. And so it's that constant, ever present, sort of the diet products that are marketed towards women and the Spanx. I've never heard of a male Spanx product, right? So
there's a market there, I'm sure.
There probably is these days. Yeah, there probably is, because somebody out there is thinking, I need to, squish this in. But, everything, right? Where somebody makes a lot of money off women not liking their bodies. And eventually somebody will figure out we can make some money off men by doing the same thing. But right now, I think that's the big difference. I sort of call it the stew, right? The stew is what we live in every day, and we can talk about body positivity or acceptance or all these things, but you still have to get up every day and exist in that stew, which is full of people who want to tell you how wrong you are. I mean, you can't even go on social media and talk about your body without, getting pretty heavily trolled. And so we're in different parts of the stew, men and women, I think, slightly different parts of the stew. So,
who do you think this book is for?
Well, I'd echo a little bit of what Jen said. I think it's for everybody. And, I think that the initial sort of demographic, the market that you think of is women or non-binary trans people who have a similar lived experience, who go, oh, I'm going to recognize myself here. I want to know what that looks like for you. Maybe I'll get some inspiration. Maybe I'll find some common empathy between experiences. But to me, that's sort of the tip of the iceberg reader. They already know what those, like most people are going to be reading through and going, yeah, I've lived that. I know that experience. Right off the top of my head, Sonya's story right away, I was like, oh man, that's inventoried my own closet that way, dozens of times in my head. So really, I hope that this book is kind of for everybody. I think that there's a lot of really deeply held, I go so far as to say hatred, right? There's hatred against people of certain bodies. And the only ways we ever learn about experiences that aren't our own are through the stories, right? So when, somebody writes a story about growing up Black, that book isn't for just fellow Black men. That book is for white women, and that book is for, kids. It's for everybody to understand that experience. If we only wrote books for people who had the same experiences as us, nothing in the world would ever change, right? So to me, the book is really kind of a hope for everybody to sort of have that opportunity.
Have you had that reaction from people? Have you heard about it trickling down?
Yeah, well,
the community?
I think, it helps that I have I have a large circle of close friends, and some of them would recognize themselves in this book, and some of them would not at all. But your friends are your friends, so they buy your book because they love you and they're going to read it. And so hearing from some of them, and they've said, "Oh, I'm passing this book along to so and so. Oh, I never thought about that way. Oh, I really enjoyed this story." That to me is like, that's the goal right there, is that they go, "I never thought about it that way. I never thought about this person's story or that person's story," right? So, yeah.
Do you consider, you talk in your introduction about the importance of words and, the labels that we place, and that you ended up calling this book big and not fat or some other word. But one other term that, we've heard a lot about is body positivity. Do you consider this book to be body positive?
No, I don't.
Is there a difference also between body positivity and acceptance?
So to tackle the first one, I would say, no, I don't consider this book to be a book about body positivity. And I think the term itself has become problematic over the years. I mean, you think about where it sort of began, which was sort of embracing differentness and size and all sorts of things. And now it's sort of become a hashtag for like, I have a stretch mark, but I'm going to put a bikini on anyways, which is not really, I mean, I'm grateful that people feel good about their stretch marks and want to put a bikini on, not to diminish that, but that's not really where the term sort of began and really sort of what the goal of it was. But I don't consider this book to be a book about body positivity. And lots of people said, "Oh, I'm so glad you've done this project. We need more stuff about body positivity." And my goal really from the beginning was to be not prescriptive in that way. I didn't want a book where each story was somebody saying, "Here's how you can be in this kind of body and live happy, fulfilling lives." That was not my goal in any way. Some of the stories are like that. Some of the stories have these wonderful sort of moments of discovery and exploration and lives sort of turning and self-perceptions changing. But some of them are like, "I'm not really happy with this particular thing, and I want to talk about that," or "I'm struggling with how I lived 20 years ago and the regret that I have over those choices 20 years ago." So to me, the book is non-prescriptive is the best way to describe it. It's just really what the subtitle of the book is. It's stories about life in plus size bodies. And I wanted stories that were not inspired and cheerful. I wanted stories that were like, "This sucks some days, and here's how I feel about this. And my mom is horrible to me at Thanksgiving dinner." Not my mom. My mom's lovely. But, because those stories, people have to see themselves in those stories. And not everybody's going to see themselves in something that's sort of super cheerful and here's how you should go out and blaze your way in the world. So no, I don't consider it to be that book. Yeah. And are the terms the same thing? There's sort of spectrums of the same thing. Like anything, I think we coin a word and it starts to mean one thing and then it sort of gets taken over, or, one of the things that comes to mind when you ask that is Amanda Scriver's story. She talks about body neutrality, which is really focused on, let's stop looking at how our bodies look, how they're perceived by other people, how sexy they are, how desirable they are. Let's focus on what our bodies do for us. My body carries me on a wonderful walk every day that I get to see beautiful things, and it made 2 children, and all of these kinds of things, right? So that concept of body neutrality is sort of further along the spectrum there, and that's something that I've been thinking about a lot since reading her story. Actually, it really brought some things home for me. So yeah, but the language of everything is so constantly evolving, and that's why it was that concept, and I talk in the introduction about words and what words mean and what words we're comfortable with, and it just changes so much from person to person. So yeah.
Has that changed how you approach your other work?
Has doing this book approached how? Yeah, I think it has, in the sense that to some degree, writing about your body, when your body is not sort of picture perfect the way that your culture expects it to, is one of the most vulnerable things I think that you can do. It's not sort of the same as, say, writing about sort of extreme traumas and sexual assault. I don't want to make that kind of comparison. But when you write about your own body, you sort of go, well, gosh, I did that. I can do any of these sort of lesser topics does not feel as scary now. I can jump into these other conversations and I can reveal about myself. And, I was a reporter for 12, 13 years. And I, through that period, often had columns. And the columns that resonated the most with people were always the ones that I acknowledged some vulnerability, some weakness, some uncertainty in myself, because people go, oh, you're a human being, and I feel that way too, right? And so I think that this book really, for me, reaffirmed what I've always known, which is that what you perceive as fearful vulnerability that's going to make you look foolish, other people and readers interpret as brave courage that makes you look the opposite of foolish. And that's hard when you recognize that in another person. When somebody else does that, you go, that's so brave of you. When you do it yourself, it's just vulnerability and fear, and I'm going to look stupid. So doing this book really reaffirmed for me that you don't lose anything by being vulnerable. You can only gain by being vulnerable. I mean, if you don't count, sort of the internet riot mobs, right? But other than that, in real things that you can only gain by being that kind of writer. So
it's transformational, turning
absolutely
into courage. This book was released on February 14th of this year, 2020. Did the pandemic affect this book? I mean, obviously not in the lead up to it, but
yeah, we had no idea what was coming, for sure. It did. It affected it. I mean, the timing couldn't have been better or worse. I'm not sure what the word is to use. We were, I had a bag on my floor packed with clothes, ready to go to Toronto the week that everything started to sort of shut down. And interestingly enough, I think because I was connected with writers in Toronto and we were going there in a few days to do a launch, I think I sort of picked up on the fact that things are changing really much faster than people on the West Coast were figuring it out. Because I started to say, I think we're canceling this. And people here were like, are you sure about that? It was like Toronto was a few days ahead of us and realizing this is serious and we need to take this seriously. Everything that we were able to get we did a Vancouver launch in early March before sort of we were aware. But everything else that came after, we had Toronto, we were coming back to Victoria to do something at Monroe's Books, which is just such a, an epic location. And I was going to go up through the interior and maybe to Alberta. And those just one by one, they all got canceled. And so at first your thought process is, well, we'll cancel, but in 3 months, we'll just reschedule everything, right? And then you slowly begin to realize this is not 3 months, this is not happening. So then you get into the, infamous sort of, you have to pivot. Right? You have to pivot. How are we going to pivot to make this work? Because for a new book, and I think especially a book like this, those launches would have been really instrumental, right? Because contributors are bringing their friends and their family, and the book sales are happening on the spot, and the word gets out, right? And your local arts newspapers put a little thing in, oh, this event is happening if you want to go, right? And when those things all cancel, that word doesn't spread the same way. So I think it absolutely affected sort of the spread of just public knowledge about the book. And then when it came time to start thinking about, well, how are we going to do this in alternate ways? I'm a mom with 2 kids, and my kids are at home, and I'm homeschooling them, and everybody's in the house. And so that concept of pivoting was like, we'll do what we can. But so it sort of felt like getting the rug pulled out from underneath. There was some hard days where I thought we've put so much time and energy into this, and I felt so much responsibility to the writers. I mean, one of the things going through this that I wanted everybody to feel was like, you're safe and your work is safe and your integrity is safe. And I hope that you feel comfortable doing this and sort of, I'm going to shepherd this little project, but it's not mine, it's everybody's. And I want everybody to feel very comfortable in that. And then to say, everything we planned has been undone. And I don't know how many people are going to read this, right? I felt sort of a real devastation over that in terms of towards the other writers in the book. But then you go, okay, well, it is what it is, right? So in a weird way, we kind of get this late doubling back, right? So now we're coming around to fall, and things are kind of, people are going, well, we're never going to reschedule an in-person thing. Let's do some literary events online. Let's do these various other things. So we sort of, in a weird way, get a second chance. Because if everything had happened normally, we'd be sort of yesterday's news by fall, right? There's all the new books coming out. So in a weird way, we sort of get to drag our little moment out a little bit more. So I'm trying to see the, the positives of that. But yeah, it was so unexpected. But I know so many writers who were putting out like first novels the same time. And, at least with an anthology, you've got a whole team of cheerleaders, right? So everybody's like, well, my aunt's going to read this book and my sister's going to buy this book. For single authors debuting in the spring, I just can't even imagine. So, relatively wise, I try to remember that we did the best we could with the circumstances at hand. So, yeah.
Indeed. So I want to talk about your piece that you included. Now, you
Sure.
said at the beginning that you had originally envisioned a whole book of your experience.
Yeah.
How did you pick which one to include if you're only going to have one piece?
Well, I picked this one because it was sort of what had started the idea of doing a whole collection. I had written this piece for originally Skirt Quarterly, which was a sort of short-lived literary magazine project here in Vancouver. And I knew the writer who had started that project, and we put it on the website, and it had gone viral. I hate to use that term, but it had gone viral, and CBC had picked up on it, and we had done a radio essay version of it. And so that piece sort of went, well, I started writing out and collecting other pieces that I had already written, but not realizing that they were connected. I started sort of collecting them together. So when it came time to choose which one to include in here, I thought, well, that was the one that already resonated with a lot of people. And let's sort of clean it up and make it a little bit more fresh. And also it was a little bit unique, right? It's written in the second person. It's a list. So it sort of changed, it had a slightly different shape over some of the other stories in the book. And I really wanted the whole collection of the anthology to have a variety of tones and voices. And I thought, well, that one fits because it's kind of a little weird and a little different, and it sort of, changes things a little bit. So that was how that one ended up in there.
Yeah. I loved how the piece that you wrote went from admonitions about how to live your life and instructions, how to approach food, and to instructions on how to appreciate your body in every way. Does this mirror the acceptance of your own body, or is it a process that is recurring every day?
That's such a good question. The answer is really both, I think, right? I think you do the work over time, but you have to do the work every day again, right? And so all of those admonitions, those rules, I think most fat women, even women who aren't fat, but are sort of, live in the stew, we know those rules, right? Like, don't eat too much in front of other people. Don't order this in front of other people. Don't do that, right? We have all these rules that we live with. Don't wear colors that are too bright and draw attention to yourself because they're not going to be flattering. And so we hyper absorb those rules, and we get, over time, a new diet comes along or a new philosophy comes along, and the rule gets absorbed on top of the other rules. So you live more and more and more sort of tightly bound around what you are allowed to do as a fat woman. And the moment in that story where I say, reconsider your thighs, and I'm lying on my side and the light's coming in the window and I'm just sort of waking up. That was a real moment. That wasn't sort of a put on kind of imaginary thing. That was a real moment, a real morning that I remember very clearly, that something just slipped. And I thought, I felt such sort of grief for how these rules had kept me so deeply from appreciating myself. So much wasted time, years of wasted time not living up to a rule, and therefore not living up to, a standard of who I ought to be. And so I think that moment was probably part of a long process of going from, okay, these are all the rules that I have to live by, and I have to hate myself. And because if you don't hate yourself, what's the motivation going to be to change? To that sort of coming to that point of sort of self-acceptance and embracing yourself and doing things because you enjoy them, and you enjoy, I think a lot of big women measure everything they do by how well it's affecting their diets, right? Like, I went to the gym today and I'm going to measure that by how many calories it was and how many steps I did. I'm not going to measure it by how great I felt when I was done and how good it felt to sweat and we're not measuring things by how they feel for us. We're measuring them by how well we've kept to a rule of what we need to do. So yeah, so that's sort of, a long process. But within that process, you wake up every day again in the stew, and some days are better than others. Some days you wake up and you go, the stew is ridiculous. And I see it very clearly. Some days you wake up
and consider your thighs.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And so I think it's a daily process. And interestingly enough, I think that's something that's been really made clear for a lot of us during the pandemic. Right away, what was one of the very first things we started talking about on social media was like, oh, the pandemic 15, right? Everybody's going to sit around at home wearing their jogging pants. And what are you going to look like when, this is your opportunity to come out at the end looking amazing or looking like you let yourself go, right? So those sort of deep messages in the stew, all of a sudden we started talking about them as soon, like we weren't talking about, gosh, how is this going to feel if my grandparents pass away? We were like, don't let yourself be a lazy slob for 6 months. Like we're in the middle of global trauma, but we're still hyper focused on that 10 or 15 pounds. Yeah. So I think it's a lifelong process, mm-hmm. and it's a daily process. And I think that that's true for anybody of any size. I have friends who are size 6s whose lives have been ruled by all of those rules that they're supposed to have, right? How they're supposed to eat and how they're supposed to behave. And
it's astonishing amount of wasted energy.
It absolutely is. Like the collective energy that we could apply to so many millions of others of things if we stopped. I think about this, you get together with girlfriends, and I've stopped doing this now. I step away from the conversation, but for years you get together, what's the way we bond? Oh my gosh, I ate 3 cookies today. I haven't worked out, even with I went to a Tupperware party once, and the first 20 minutes was everybody talking about their next diet or what they had done that day, or, oh, their pants didn't fit. And what that actually did was bonded us as strangers, right? Like, oh, we're all women and we all know what the rules are. We're not allowed to like ourselves. We dislike ourselves equally, therefore we can be friends.
And we still need to buy Tupperware to put our cookies
in. Well, to put our healthy foods in. That's how we're going to sell it, right? It's the healthy foods that are going to it's going to be easier for you to be thin. What if we spent that 20 minutes at the start of the Tupperware conversation or the Tupperware party having conversations about who we're going to vote for in the next election? What are, oh, I'm working on this sculpture project. Let me tell you about that, right? We don't do that. We default to this conversation that is exhausting. So, yeah.
Thank you, Christina. Okay. I'm going to move on to you.
Thank you.
Sonya, your piece is called, I don't even know how to say it out loud. So
You're good. I
it's called 50 Shades of Black crossed out fat, an inventory. And you approach an inventory of your black clothing in your closet and how, which you're modeling right now, how you approach the world through your clothes and how the world approaches you. And the clothing is sort of a buffer between the world and ourselves. Do you think that buffering layer is different for big people than for average people?
So I think I think clothing can be a really important marker of our identity. Like it's such an important communicative medium, right? So whatever we wear immediately broadcasts to other people what we think of ourselves, how we operate through the world, how we move through the world, but it also broadcasts in ways that disrupt sometimes their understandings of how things operate, right? So, but it's also a form of armor. So in this way, I'm thinking of actually, I was teaching fat studies this winter term, and we had a bunch of guest speakers, and we were supposed to have Christina, but we all got tangled up in pandemic times. But I had a grad student come from the education department, and she is someone who is working on a fat studies project. She's an international student from Iran, and she talked about the fact that when she was a teenager, she went through a period where she decided she was very devout, that she would be a very devout Muslim. And she looked back on that time and she realizes that actually that notion of devotion was related to the fact that she could wear a chador during that period. And she said it was cheap, it was one size, and it was black. And she could walk through town, nobody looked at her, she could do whatever she wanted, she felt safe, she was comfortable, nobody judged her on her looks, nothing. And so, and really came back to a couple times, she said, it was cheap, it was black, and it was one size. She didn't even have to think about the policing nature of clothes in any way, shape, or form, which I know that resonated a lot with my students, because a lot of them spent a lot of time thinking about what clothes they were wearing, what clothes they weren't wearing. And I had a class that was students who were all different shapes and sizes, right? They were fat bodies, they were thin bodies, there were big bodies, there were small bodies, all different kinds of bodies. But clothing was important for them. One of the other books that we had read in that term was Mona Awad's 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl. And I don't know if either of you have read it, but in that book, there's an inordinate amount of attention paid to clothing and the role of clothing. And in that particular book, clothing almost takes on agency of its own as it affects the main character's life. And so the clothing strangles her. The clothing does things to her in various sorts of ways. And so the clothing as an instrument of discipline in some sorts of ways. I had written down a note somewhere in relation to what Christina pointed out about jogging pants right at the beginning of the pandemic. Everybody's going to be wearing jogging pants. Well, jogging pants are not instruments of discipline because they let you spill out, because they're comfy and they let you spill out, right? And so if you're going to wear jogging pants all the time, how will you ever know if you're the right size, right? Whereas if you're wearing something with a belt or with a formal sort of waistline, sort of defined waistline, then your clothing will tell you when you have gone out of line. And in that way, the clothing becomes a sort of an agent over your own life, right? So I think that this notion of how clothing operates in various ways for many people. The way it operates differently for fat people, and I'm going to use the word fat just because that's what I've been using for my fat studies class and so on, is that the way other people react to it. So for example, if we look at some progressive critiques of Donald Trump, they don't even focus on the issues. They focus on the fact that he's spilling over his pants. Who cares if he's spilling over his pants? Aren't we interested in
worse things?
Right? Like if you're worried about Donald Trump, aren't you interested in his policies? Isn't that what you're going to critique? Or why is that fatness comes to stand in for those critiques as an evidence of his weakness, as evidence of the fact that he is not what they want, right? So fatness plays in different ways, for muffin tops, all that kind of stuff, right? The language that is directed to people. And certainly I had this book as a prize at the end of term in my class. I just drew a name out of a hat and I gave it to someone in the class. And a number of students, when they took fat studies, they were like, thinking about fat studies made me reevaluate my own biases towards fat people in ways. It made me uncomfortable because I had to interrogate my own stigmatizing behaviors towards other people. Anyway, that's another sort of thing.
Do you see, for you, does writing act as a buffer in similar ways to clothing between you and the world?
In this piece, I think that's a super interesting question, because in this piece, I chose to write in second person. And I specifically chose that because second person allowed me to be both distant and more vulnerable at the same time. So by using you all the time, I could put it out there somewhere far away. But at the same time, that you allowed me to interrogate in much more intimate and vulnerable ways what I was trying to get at. Yeah. So it was both, in some ways, the second person was a buffering thing. Absolutely. I don't think I would ever have written this in first person, ever. Even though the second person allowed me to get at the first person, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it isn't you, it's...
Yeah, yeah, exactly. that you actually was it was sort of this mobile you that allowed me to be me, if you will. It allowed me to go back and forth on that. So I think writing can absolutely be a buffer. The writing choices we make, the writing itself is in some ways, when I'm doing the creative nonfiction or memoir stuff, is trying to get at the inside of me. So not a buffer, but the writing choices I make can be a buffer between me and who's reading it, if that makes sense.
It seems to me that the use of the second person like that is also an invitation to the reader.
It absolutely can be, yeah.
Because then you can be, the person reading the book.
Yeah, and also for me, honestly, that you was a you that was filled with rage, with grief, with discomfort, with all sorts of things, right? There was all sorts of stuff in that you that I could never have taken on with an I, but I could take it on with a you. And then that you becomes then an invitation. Are you as a reader willing to take that on too? So
Yeah. Amazing. In your academic work, you write a lot about identity and corporeal feminism. So that's where the body itself is the starting point of feminist analysis. What's different about these topics when their work's about you, the writer, as an individual, instead of feminism in general?
So I'm just going to first say I have my feminist mug. This was entirely accidental.
Oh no,
You know what I took with me. I will say that in some case, I would say that the starting points are always the same. This notion of embodied knowledge, the knowledge that you carry within your body and what that knowledge can lead you to. So that starting point is the same whether I am writing sort of creative nonfiction, whether I'm writing academic stuff. That stuff comes from a background of being a musician where the sound, everything is inside your body. And anybody who's done particularly wind instruments and or singing will recognize those particular elements of it. That said, it's all the other influences that might be different. So when I'm doing academic work, I might then start from the location of the body, but then link it to what other writers have said about bodies and embodiment in different sorts of ways and use more theoretical language in various sorts of ways. If I'm writing creative nonfiction, I'm going to, my influences are going to be on my environment, my local environment, what's in the news, what it feels like to walk around in the world, how I move in my body, right? So I think the impetus, this notion of the personal as political, that personal is deeply embodied. That personal is inside our skin. It's in this world, this thing that we inhabit. And Simone de Beauvoir, she says, the body is the instrument of our grasp on the world, right? It is what I live in is how I understand the world. So it's always going to start from there, but it's going to move out in different directions, if that makes sense.
Do you find, when you're writing in a more academic way, do you find any of the same kind of vulnerability that you experience when you're writing memoir?
Sometimes, yes, and it's certainly in relation to fatness, yes. Mm-hmm. Because I know that when I write about fatness, that fatness is automatically imposed on my body as the researcher, right? And so it's the same thing when people are writing, often writing about queerness, say, and they themselves might be queer, or they're writing about blackness and they themselves, they know that as soon as they write about that topic, their bodies are going to be seen to stand in for all of that topic, right? Mm-hmm. So it's over-determined. If you go back to that notion of hypervisibility, the hypervisibility of the researcher, if I write about fatness, oh, well, it's biased because that's a fat person, right? And so that's where the vulnerability lies.
And you think that there's more of that in the issue of fatness than there is in the issue of queerness or whatever?
I don't think there's more.
People don't say, oh, they're biased because they're queer, so they're writing that way.
Well, no, they absolutely will say it. This is, and maybe I wasn't clear on that. I think it's the same, not the same, but there are similar experiences of being overdetermined by one's identity. That if people know that identity, and they write from that identity about that particular topic. That said, visible identities or visibilized identities, like racialization, like body size and so on, disability sometimes can be in that role as well, can be read by others even if they don't know who you are, right? So I think that, for example, researchers who talk about their research on Twitter, if you present as a pleasant, hetero, cis woman on Twitter, you will get less harassment about your research than if you present as a pleasant, cis, hetero, fat woman, and less than if you present as, say, a non-cis Black person, or whatever, right? So each of those categories affects how whatever it is that you're doing is received by others.
And it's exponential.
It's exponential, yeah. It really, so some people will never experience abuse on social media. Never. Some people say one word and it all, the monsters descend immediately, right? So I think it does, the vulnerability lies in relation to your relationship with the material that you're writing about, whether that material is personal or whether it is scholarly. It happens in both instances.
Yeah. What's your sense of where the public, and I say this in a more general term, not academic discourse, but the public discourse is at in terms of body acceptance or body neutrality, and where does this book fit into that public discourse?
I think there's a lot more conversation about it than there was even like 5 years ago, even, and far more than there was 10 years ago. I think there's been a lot of pushback against a lot of problems with mainstream obesity discourse, pushback against the kinds of issues that fat people face when they go to doctors and they're misdiagnosed and everything. So there's a lot more stuff out there. I can speak also from my class. The first time I taught fat studies, I had 13 students. The second time I taught it, I had 35, right? So it shifted completely, and the interest that the students had was also very different. So there's a lot more publications out there. I also imagine that this book is right here. I suspect that 5 years ago, it wouldn't have hit the moment that it's hit now. I think it hit at a really good time in terms of people wanting to have more conversations about body diversity, about size, about all sorts of things that perhaps we, and I'm using we here as a sort of a general collective middle class-ish Canadian we're not necessarily ready to have at a popular level. I don't know if Christina feels the same way about that, but I think that part of the reason it's resonated so well is that we were finally ready for it. What I will say is that I'm really glad that Christina sent out this call and that I was able to be a part of it. I've written a lot of stuff. I've not written a lot of stuff about fatness in my own life. Partly because I spent a childhood of being shamed by my parents all the way through, right? So, and so I think at a personal level, it was important, but I think it's also socially important, which we've already seen as well on various occasions. And it's also, like, as I said, for my students, it's been really important to see these kinds of voices come through in many ways. And I've also made friendships. I'm not wearing entirely black. I'm going to see if I can do yoga, sort of yoga. And then Christina, I can see.
Oh!
And those leggings exist because Christina had posted something about leggings, and I had said they were so wonderful. And she said, you should get them from here. And so I ordered them. And so now I have a collection of very bright leggings, all due to Christina. Yay. And that happened without this book.
Yeah, shout out to Sweet Legs. They're in BC actually, and they make plus and plus two, and they have all sorts of sizes, and yeah, we love them.
Fantastic changes from like transformational to sartorial. Excellent. Well, I want to thank you all for joining me. Thank you to Christina Myers and Sonya Boon and Jen Arbo for being our guests today talking about their book. I'll hold it up one more time. Big Stories About Life in Plus-Size Bodies. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for that, Caitlin, Sonya, Christina, and Jen. I'd also like to thank again the Arts Council in New Westminster for helping to make tonight happen. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like on social media, give us a call, and be sure to share with your friends. For more information about tonight's authors, please check out the description box below. And remember to join us again for Evening 3 of our Author Festival, where we discuss the storytellers. If you haven't already, also check out Evening 1, where we discuss crafting mysteries. Thanks again for joining us, and see you next time.